Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 58 of the Ask Historians podcast, a listener-supported podcast. So today's episode is a bit of a treat for me, and I hope it will be for you as well. I tend to think of myself as having a fairly good grasp of history, world history, history throughout time, etc., etc. You know, kind of generally feeling like I have a pretty good mental schema of what was going on where, when. And particularly in kind of that early colonial period in Latin America. But this topic that we're talking about today, I literally had no idea about until I started talking to our guest about possible topic ideas. And that is, today's topic is going to be about a German colonial venture in the Americas in Venezuela, or what is now Venezuela, in the early 16th century, which is, 1500s. So right at the time that we're thinking that the entire Americas are filled with Spanish conquistadors roaming around, there was also some German conquistadors, or whatever the conquistador term is in German. So it was an incredible delight for me to kind of find something I had no idea about, something brand new, which I hope you'll experience that same kind of joy of discovery with me with this podcast. Although hopefully the joy of discovery with significantly less being shot with poison arrows, running slave trading, and generally just dying. There is a lot of dying in this episode, and not a whole lot of reasons given for why dying. It's just, as we'll discuss, literally people just die, and they get noted down as died, and that's it. History is fickle like that. Cruel and fickle. And on that note, I hope you enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Today I'm here with Yawarpoma, as he's known on the boards, but also Spencer in more natural and real life. And we'll be talking about early colonial ventures in northern South America. So Colombia, Venezuela, that particular area. But in particular, an early German venture that I think is not very well known to many people. So Spence, before we get into that, what got you interested in this topic, both on this particular topic and more general in this area of history?
Well, I started work as a late undergrad student, early master's student in the American Civil War, especially German observers to the American Civil War and German immigrants during the Civil War. And the research really wasn't going anywhere, and my advisor sort of suggested that if I was interested in working on Germans in any way, there was this area in his particular field, which was colonial Latin America, that had not really been studied in depth, at least within our generation. And he sort of pointed me down south into Venezuela. He worked on Colombia himself. And it was remarkable, just sort of the things that I found. No one was talking about it. No one had even known that Germans were in South America this early period. And it just sort of went from there, and I've been running with that, I guess, since 2007, 2008.
Yeah, I noticed that some of the articles that I was looking into and some of the ones you had suggested for background research, a lot of them are from the 50s, the 60s, and then it kind of tails off from there. And I suppose we'll talk about that a little bit later. But as we get into it, I mean, what was this? How did this adventure get started, essentially?
Which adventure?
Yeah, your own personal adventure. No, how did this expedition to, of these Germans to Venezuela, of all places, get started? I mean, what was the impetus and drive behind it?
Well, you have to understand that at this time in Europe, you have really for the first time a unified sort of political power in Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire and Charles I of Spain being the same person. And so Charles is able to draw on his sort of Iberian side, which is already in the Americas, and his, just for lack of a better term, German-speaking side, which has access to trade networks, which has access to resources, access to economic endeavors that no one else is really exploiting at the time. And he's at this unique juncture in that he's not only dealing with Henry in England and Francis, the king of France, I believe, but he's also working with this Ottoman threat that's coming from the east, these odd heretical beliefs that are happening in his own territory in South Germany, the Bavarian areas. And he is trying to figure out how he can either make more money to prevent this Ottoman, push into his territory, make more money to try to keep out the heretical powers, make more money to keep out these other kings in Europe from taking his control. And it just sort of leads him to utilizing his own men from this other section of Europe into something that's already going on. So moving these Germans, moving these Eastern and Central Europeans into the Americas, where there's already sort of a bustling economy, bustling political administration developing in the Caribbean.
Because, of course, not only is just the Holy Roman Empire, but as you noted, also the King of Spain, technically all of this was under his dominion generally over in the Americas.
Right.
Yeah, so who was it that first came to him and said, appealing to his German side, which I suppose we'll keep using as opposed to saying appealing to his Holy Roman Emperor side, who was it that first came to him and said, Your Holiness, we would like to go and, found our own German expedition to the Americas?
Oddly enough, I think it's actually Charles who offers this to the South Germans. And I'm going to call them South Germans. I know that's a terrible way to explain them, but just because there's no real national identity, and I think most of them would consider themselves residents of whatever city they're in, it's kind of hard to say. So I'll say South Germans just to make it sort of uniform. But Charles and many of the other princes of Europe are borrowing money left and right, mainly from big merchant companies and big merchant families, massive donors. And one of the two groups that he's linked with quite heavily are the Welsers out of the Ulm-Augsburg corridor in sort of western Bavaria, and the Fuggers, who are in the exact same area, although mostly based out of Augsburg. And he's borrowing money from them. He's giving them lands in Spain. He's trying to give them access to sort of trade connections in the Caribbean. And depending on which source we use, and depending on whether you believe those sources, offering the Welsers, the area that is now Venezuela, Western Venezuela, as a way to secure future loans from them by saying, you can take this land, you can exploit it, settle it, utilize it how you wish, I'll give you tax benefits, and in return, we maintain peaceful relations, and if I need to, I can come to you for more loans. He does this to the Fuggers also, and he actually gives them the area sort of south of what's now Peru and in Bolivia, and really gives them the area that would become Potosi, and they never really get over there, which is sort of a big what if of Latin American history if this big German merchant family actually settled the crown jewel of the colonial South American economy before the Spaniards really got there in force. But that's a completely separate podcast, I'm sure.
Yeah, but because for those who are not aware, Potosi is essentially the largest silver mine ever when it comes down to it.
Yeah, it's amazing how much it revolves. The colonial economy revolves around Potosi in the late 1500s and 1600s, and there's Spanish phrases that utilize it. But the Fuggers were given that originally, and then they never really advanced on it. But the Welsers were very quick to snatch up anything they could to get into the Americas, and they sort of had this long game of pressing into Iberia, pressing into the Mediterranean, getting into the Caribbean, and once they had the chance of getting into the American mainlands, they jumped at it.
So what was the charter that, because, typically these things come with some sort of official, royal decree or royal charter saying, you can have this land in exchange for doing X, Y, and Z. So what was the kind of charter that the Welsers got from Charles V?
Well, they were required to build a couple of fortifications. They were required to build a few cities. They were required to bring in a certain amount of settlers, and those settlers would be given small plots of land, which they could be taxed on and they could sell off as their own after a number of years. The main thing was that they were incentives, really, that are being given. A lot of tax incentives. They wouldn't have to pay the royal fifth in full for a number of years. The governor would be paid a substantial salary. The heads of each fortification, they call them wardens, would be paid a substantial salary. The captain general of the province, or the military commander, if we want to call it a military at all, would be given a significant salary. Any gold or precious metals that were found, they got to keep a certain amount of it and not have to pay the full tax on it for a number of years. It was actually a rather substantial contract, and it's not unlike many of the contracts that are going around at the time. There are several contracts that are being offered to conquistadors going through Florida that are going to Santa Marta, which is sort of the area west of what I'm talking about in northern Colombia. And they're all sort of like this, that they have to set up a town, set up a fort. They don't describe exactly how large that fort should be or town should be, just says build a town, build a fort. But a lot of it is tax incentives to convince people to come over. If you can convince people that they're going to make something, that they get to keep what they make or keep what they find, they're more likely to come over and settle in this area, especially if they get a free plot of land or a free house that is funded by the king or funded by whoever is managing the colony itself. The biggest thing really that the contract lacks is how do you deal with conversion? Because sort of the old idea of what the Spaniards are doing is it's gold, it's glory, it's for king and country, but there really isn't a lot of glory to God in the document. It says that everyone should be good Christians, but it doesn't say that there should be heavy conversions. In fact, it really says if you find any indigenous peoples there that are challenging our authority, you have every right to enslave them and do what you want with them. So the idea of a sort of religious experience and bringing in lots of priests and friars is really lacking in the document. And that's something that I found especially striking when I saw it.
No, were they still operating at this point under the kind of the legal rubric of the requerimiento at this point? Oh,
absolutely. Absolutely they are. So they're going in, they're reading it. From what I understand, they never read it in German. They did read it in Latin as much as possible. But again, as I'm sure you're aware and your listeners are aware, they could really just stand on the ship and read it out loud a mile offshore. And they've technically fulfilled that requirement to read this thing that says you either obey us or we enslave you. But the contract very specifically mentions that if they want to engage in Indian slavery, they can. And I think this is mainly because they're not allowed to set up encomiendas. Bartolome de las Casas, who's probably has the king's ear, or at least has some of his advisors in the court when this document is being drawn up, has tried and failed to get encomiendas sort of removed from the Caribbean. But you can start to see the beginnings of this effort succeeding. And I think it really starts here with this contract, because unlike many of the other contracts that are going around, and even some that are occurring afterwards, Pizarro's, for example, which is written after this contract, they're allowed to give encomiendas. But maybe because Welser, Venezuela is so close to Bartolome de las Casas' sort of failed experiment in eastern Venezuela, maybe he sort of convinces, don't let these guys set up encomiendas just yet. And that sort of sets a detriment to the colony from the very beginning. But I think that's why they add in all these. You can enslave as many people as you need to if they're challenging your authority, just to sort of make up for this impediment.
Yeah, and just to clarify for those who are not in the know of kind of mid 16th century Caribbean Latin American politics, de las Casas was a Spanish priest who was very critical of the treatment of the natives of the Americas, and encomiendas were essentially land grants and grants of people to essentially conquistadors, saying you not only own this land but you own the people in it, and they owe you a labor debt, and that fueled a lot of abuses.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so in a way, because de las Casas, I mean, his efforts often had a sort of perverse back blow. Famously he was said, don't enslave the Indians, instead let's bring over African slaves, kind of things like that. And it seems like this is another kind of way where his efforts to avoid legal abuses through the encomiendas it seemed perversely to increased enslavement of the natives.
Oh, absolutely. It was rather upsetting, I think, to many of the Germans, because they had already been working on bringing in African slaves. They'd been awarded a rather massive asiento, a contract, to bring in 4,000 African slaves into the Caribbean. And so they'd already had that market sort of cornered for a brief period. And I think being told that they couldn't have the encomienda means that they would have been forced to acquire Indian slaves and, in a way, almost competing against themselves, trying to manage an Indian slave trade as well as an African slave trade. And so they got out of the African slave trade pretty quickly after this contract was passed. But the Indian slave trade was never as successful as what would become this massive transatlantic African trade.
So let's go to the colony itself. I mean, sure. When is it established, and who is leading it at this time?
Well, it had already been sort of founded, and the main capital had been created as early as 1526, 1527 by a guy named Juan de Ampiés. And he's sitting in Coro, which is a small village just southeast of sort of Lake Maracaibo in what's now western Venezuela. And this contract is signed in 1528. A sort of a administrator, I've always utilized the sort of the tongue-in-cheek phrase of a CEO with a sword, a guy named by the name of Alfinquer. Alfinquer is in Santo Domingo. He's doing quite well for himself. He's setting up trade networks for the Welsers, but he's told to be the governor, and he's told to go to Venezuela and take control of their area. And so he goes into Coro in 1529, and he basically walks up to Juan de Ampiés and he shows him the contract and says, "We're gonna claim this area now. Please leave." Ampiés is furious. He tries to write to the king to get this land back. It doesn't work, and he goes on to settle some islands off the coast of Venezuela, Aruba and some of the other smaller islands in the South Caribbean. But it had already been there. There'd already been an attempt to convert some of the indigenous peoples there. There'd already been an attempt to settle there, but it was not very successful. It was really a very basic settlement, and the Germans wrote about how poor it was when they got there, and about how terrible the people seemed and ill-fed, and the weather was just bad. And unfortunately, Spaniards who would come 30 years later, 40 years later, would make the exact same claims about them when they first stepped off the boats into Coro and Venezuela.
And I think we'll talk a little about the reasons why that was. But what were the Germans' initial plans for this then? For this, kind of tiny, sad little settlement?
Well, one of the major issues that I've had when I was writing about this was trying to figure out what their plan is, because there is no plan on the surface. I've looked in archives in Germany, the archives in Spain, there's archives in Colombia. Oddly enough, there are no significant remaining archives that are in Venezuela that have not just been photocopied documents from those other archives. So Venezuela is sort of lacking in that, and it's probably a little dangerous to really attempt to dig deeper into that. However, looking at it, there is no smoking gun of we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and then we're going to settle and we're going to make money this. There is none of that. You sort of have to piece it together. And one of the things that we were able to sort of figure out is that if you look at how Europeans are seeing Latin America and are seeing the Caribbean, they are believing that it's a chain of islands in many respects. And depending on which map maker you're using and which explorers you're using, that opinion sort of changes. But in Europe, there's still this idea that the northern coast of South America is really just a massive island that they have to get around. And there's got to be a waterway that connects what's the Caribbean into what they call the South Sea or the Pacific.
And of course, Lake Maracaibo was thought to be that, right? Absolutely.
If they could connect Maracaibo to the Pacific, which they believed it had to be, it was a huge lake. There's no other way you could have that kind of a lake. I guess in their mind, they thought, without there being some sort of river that connects it to the Pacific. And so they're constantly going into the Maracaibo area, trying to find a way into inland Venezuela through this waterway, maybe go over and across these mountains that they know are just in the distance, and the Pacific Ocean will just sort of be on the other side. And maybe they'll run into these explorers that are coming in from the west, from Panama, Pizarro, for example. But they're never able to do that. But I think that's what their main plan is, because they never really set up the towns. They never set up the forts that they're required to do in their contract in, a colonial settlement way. They're doing it in a way that is going to protect this economic venture. So they set up a town and a fort on the west side of the lake, Maracaibo, the proper name of Maracaibo City. They set up Coro, and it seems like they're trying to encourage trade out of this lake so that you can have explorers come in from the Caribbean, stop and resupply in Coro or in Maracaibo area, continue on their way through the Pacific, and they would go to China, I would assume is where they're trying to get to. Essentially like a Canary Islands off Africa. Everyone would leave Spain, leave Seville, go to the Canary Islands to resupply, and then go across and make their Atlantic voyage. And I think they were trying to get Venezuela to be this type of stopping point to resupply their ships.
But of course, this is all predicated on the idea that you could, sail straight through Lake Maracaibo into the Pacific.
Absolutely. And it took them a couple years to figure out it's just not going to happen. And once they do that is when everything really falls apart for the Welsers and as a political entity, because now they have to figure out, well, how do we change from being sort of a business that has this plan that now that plan is really gone. What do we do now? We've invested all of this time and money on this one thing. What's going to happen? And that's really where a lot of my research has been looking for the past few years, is how do you take this old world business strategy that in Europe works perfectly and makes them money. They're one of the most successful, I'm going to call them a corporation because there really is no better word for it, one of the most successful corporations in the world. I mean, it stretches across Europe, it stretches into the Atlantic, it stretches into Africa and the Caribbean. But when those strategies fail to work on the mainland of America, they don't know what to do with themselves. And so most of what happens in Venezuela, especially after the 1530s and 1531-32, is based on how do we recover from this failed plan, and how can we get our money back and perhaps make something of this odd little land out in the South Caribbean.
It sounds like, from what you're describing, that, as they realized that perhaps they were not going to have this very easy route to the Pacific, that they essentially need to look around and be like, well, what do we have? And I mean, is that what's kind of prompting these sort of expeditions into the backcountry?
Oh, absolutely. They're trying to find sort of what a lot of these expeditions are trying to find is either a indigenous settlement like Cortés had found in 1519, to find some sort of source of gold as they're finding in Santo Domingo and Hispaniola proper. And by looking over the next ridge, looking through the next clearing, trying to find this great city, trying to find this great civilization, they know that they'll be able to sort of make money and have a profit. And this is sort of exacerbated once news of Pizarro's sort of conquests start to filter through in 1534, 1535, and a lot of people just leave and head to Peru. And this even continues when people start to realize that the Maya and the Yucatan have not exactly been conquered either. And Montejo, the conquistador there, attracts a lot of the conquistadors who were in Venezuela at the time because they don't think they're going to find anything. And so they all go to the Yucatan or they go to Peru. And those guys they suffer horribly. Anyone who goes to Venezuela and survives and goes somewhere else normally dies almost immediately because they go to places that are probably much far worse than what's in Venezuela. But if you go on an expedition into Venezuela, you're probably going to die too. So it's sort of a lose-lose situation for Venezuela, especially in 1535 and after.
Well, I mean, let's talk about dying in Venezuela then.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, Anger, Alfinger, the sources tend to, these are Germans, but they're usually told through Spanish sources, so we tend to use Spanish names, which I guess what we're going to be doing mostly here. So Alfinger, when he arrives, I mean, he pretty much immediately launches off onto an expedition from Coro, correct?
Absolutely.
And I mean, where is he going? Presumably he's still looking for that southern passage, but, where does he go?
Well, his first entrada leaves in 1529. He takes 160 men with him, and he's really circling around Maracaibo, and he's trying to find this waterway. He's not finding it, and that's really upsetting him, but he is finding indigenous groups. He is finding evidence that there are at least elements of civilization, what he would consider to be groups that he can work with, that he can create some sort of diplomatic relations with, but there's also groups there that he can enslave. And having lived in Santo Domingo for a number of years, one of the things that he has noticed is that the indigenous population of Santo Domingo is dying off very quickly. And one of the ideas that had sort of been floating around in the late 1520s in Santo Domingo was, what if you take the indigenous peoples from other islands and bring them into Hispaniola to repopulate? What if we go down south to Santa Marta, to Colombia, and bring in those individuals and we can repopulate? And so I think a lot of what Alfinger is doing in this first trip, once he sort of realizes that this waterway is, if it's there, it's very difficult to find. And if it's not there, we have to find some sort of ability to make money off of this trip. He starts to organize groups of his men to capture indigenous peoples, order them into elements of, are they nice? Are they more ferocious? Are they sodomites? Are they polygamists? Are they cannibals? And depending on what sort of level they are of distaste in his eyes, he's able to send them to Santo Domingo to make a rather sizable profit. And he's rather successful in this. Santo Domingo welcomes in all these Indian slaves because they need the manpower. They need the labor desperately.
I mean, so what kind of groups is he actually encountering?
Depending on how we're defining them, they are Arawak, Carib type peoples. They have rather small settlements that are created. They do not use any sort of brick and mortar. It's basically all straw and thatch, wooden huts. They're able to move very quickly through the bush, and they're able to utilize the waterways rather easily. They have canoes that are rather fast. They have poisoned arrows, which the Europeans are very quick to point out are very dangerous and deadly. There were a few Spaniards who are killed with Alfonso on that first expedition by these poisoned arrows, and they sort of realize this is going to be a lot harder than maybe we first thought. And they start to really the Europeans start to see these indigenous peoples as maybe not a threat, but start to see them as something that is going to take more time to subdue. It's going to be a hazard. Yeah. Start to really take care. And they also start to say, we need to find some sort of diplomatic relations with whoever is nearby. And they do that. The Caquetillos, a particular group, are in and around the Coro area, and they quickly establish sort of a peaceful relationship with the Europeans. The Europeans sort of allow the Caquetillos to enter the area, to trade with them. They have to sort of go to mass and sort of engage in some sort of conversion activities, but it's never intense. And in exchange, the Europeans buy these Indian slaves from the Caquetillos. And depending on how we're going to view that, because there's really no understanding of what the Caquetillos are doing outside of the eyes of the Europeans, but it seems like they are capturing their own enemies. They're capturing groups that are upsetting their own agenda, and they're selling those captives, those war captives, to the Europeans just to get them out of the territory completely. So there's no way that their enemies can ever get them back. So there's something exciting going on beyond the surface of this European indigenous diplomacy in Venezuela. And it'd be nice to say that we have a sort of a thorough record of what's going on, but we really don't. We just have what numbers of groups are coming in, when they're coming in, when the indigenous peoples are fighting Europeans. We sort of have what names they might be fighting. But in terms of a really clear plan of action that you might find in, say, the Andes or in Mexico, with written indigenous sources sort of saying what's going on, there's none of that in Venezuela.
Yeah, so it sounds like Alfonso is really just kind of running a slave trade at this point. You know, it doesn't seem like he's trying to develop much else beyond that. Absolutely. He's developing this because at the same time that Alfonso is going into Venezuela and working on trying to find this trade route, the Welsers have also negotiated a contract with the crown that brings in about 50 to 100. The number is never very clear, but I've always used 50. Master miners from Germany. And these guys, and I say Germany very loosely, these guys are mainly from what's now Western Poland, from what's now the border between the Czech Republic and Germany, from northern Austria, the Tyrol region. The Erzgebirge is sort of the main area they're from in sort of northwestern, what is now northwestern Germany. And these guys are silver, gold, salt, iron miners, and they know exactly how to find these things, to exploit these deposits, and they're being attracted out of Europe to come to the New World, and some are told to come to Venezuela to find this stuff, and the few that do arrive and really try to find these deposits end up dying very quickly. The weather is terrible. The climate is just not conducive to this sort of mining operations. I mean, obviously, these guys are not doing the physical mining. They have slave labor for that. But I think in the 1540s and 1550s, you have sort of legal documents sort of asking, do you remember when these guys showed up? And all the Spaniards, and including one miner who survived, say, oh, yeah, we were there. We saw them. They all died. The weather was just too hot. Germans cannot survive in hot weather. Almost to a man is what they say. And even the one German who survives, his name is Urban Belem, he says, oh yeah, it was way too difficult to live. This is not our climate. Yeah, and I suppose we can kind of speculate as to whether, malaria or yellow fever or something else like that had reached the Americas at that point. Yeah, I don't find evidence of that, but it's very possible. Just the way they sort of drop down from the heat and from sort of exhaustion, it's very possible. But they wouldn't have. They never really wrote about what people looked like when they were dying. It was really just they just died. Well, they just died, and there's a few times they just write that that person died, and you never hear anything about it, and it's so upsetting because it's either did they die from sort of a fight with this indigenous warrior, or they die in a skirmish,
Did they die from a disease? And almost...
Was it heat stroke, dysentery, dehydration?
Yeah, so I've always just assumed it was the climate. That's because what they say. Now, again, it's very possible that it could be some sort of disease like malaria or like a yellow fever or dengue or something very similar, but they never really go into specifics the way that some of them would do when they were in, say, Santo Domingo, and they're writing about all the diseases that are happening to the Indians there, or in Mexico, and they're writing about the diseases that are happening to the Mexica and the Nahua. They're not describing or drawing these things out. But in Venezuela, it's just, they died, and they just sort of leave it at that.
So to stick with our theme of dying, Alfinger does not last too long himself either, does he?
No, he goes back to Santo Domingo after his first expedition to recover, probably to sort of take care of some of his finances, I would assume, because he still has a bit of a business that's working on in Santo Domingo. He comes back in 1531, and he goes on another expedition, and then he dies in 1532. His translator, Esteban Martin, actually writes this beautiful account of how Alfinger charged his way through a valley, attacked a bunch of indigenous warriors. They drove them from the field, and as Alfinger and his men were sort of returning to camp in this deep ravine, someone pointed out, "Oh, Governor, you've been shot by an arrow," and 3 days later, he sort of dies and sort of wastes away from this poisoned arrow. But it's a rather beautiful, almost medieval knight kind of death that Esteban Martin writes up. But the short of it is that Alfinger is hit by one of these poisoned arrows, and there's nothing they can do to sort of fix this wound and to help him. And he dies, and the expedition takes another year before it finally gets back to Coro. So he dies roughly in the area southwest of what's Lake Maracaibo.
Yeah, and I guess I should point out that a lot of what we're talking about here is mostly western Venezuela, kind of eastern Colombia, with parts beyond in eastern Venezuela kind of largely untouched.
Yeah. Their contract says they can go all the way to Cumaná, which is really far east into Venezuela, but they never do. They never get that far east. I think only one expedition goes that way. There's another Spanish group which actually lands in sort of what's now central Venezuela, sort of south of what's now Caracas, and they don't get off the ground very much either. But the Welsers sort of territory that they're given in the contract and the territory that they sort of claim by exploring and being in places are very different places, or very different outlines of geography.
So with Alfinger's death, we see another kind of German CEO with a sword coming in, and that would be von Speer, or Espira, as he's known in the Spanish sources.
Yeah, Espira is a rather unique guy. He, I think, wants to be a decent person. I think he wants to be a decent leader. He, at many times, is trying to work with the church, which is starting to develop in Venezuela at the time. A bishop is appointed. His name is Rodrigo de Bastidas, not to be confused with his conquistador father, also named Rodrigo de Bastidas, who died in Santo Domingo a few years before this. And Espira sort of realizes that this colony, if he wants it to actually survive and make money for his backers, which are the Welser family that's living in Europe, and for the king, he's going to have to turn it into something profitable. And the only thing profitable that he knows how to do is to lead these expeditions into the interior, bring back slaves, and maybe they can build a settlement. Maybe they can sort of thrive on this money they're making from the slave trade. It's just, unfortunately, while this is going on, 1530s, 1536, when he takes power, the African slave trade is starting to get into full effect in the Caribbean. And it's being seen that these Indian slaves, which are coming north from South America to resupply these diminishing numbers in the Caribbean islands, are much better used where they are, and that we should just maybe focus on just bringing in African slaves into Cuba and Puerto Rico and Jamaica, and sort of ignore sort of repopulating as Alfinger had tried to do. So Espira is really trying to make something out of what's going to become nothing. And he goes on a rather significant expedition on his own to try to bring something back. It takes 400 guys in 1535. He comes back 3 years later with only 160. So, guys are dying rather quickly, and they're not having a lot to show for it.
They had already arrived knowing about, Cortez in what is now Mexico. But, at this point, really, especially, leaving in 1535, that's pretty much the exact same time that Pizarro was kind of finalizing that first major phase of the conquest of what is now Peru. I mean, were these reports getting back to the Venezuelan colony and kind of spurring them on into finding their own Peru or their own Mexico?
Oh, absolutely. Pizarro has to cross Panama and then go through the Caribbean to get back to Europe, and he's stopping at a few places and to resupply, and it's very clear they found something. I mean, rumor spreads so quickly. So the settlers that are in Venezuela believe that they can find, I guess, the eastern border of this Andean civilization that Pizarro's found. And so by sort of working their way along the eastern side of the northern Andes that cross into Venezuela and Colombia, they're going to find it. But they're also starting to develop this idea, and there are many, and I'm sure this is another problem with this particular period of all these rumors going around. But they're starting to develop the idea of an El Dorado, starting to develop the idea of this sort of city of gold. Everything is paved with gold, houses are of gold, everyone is fabulously rich, and they're easy to take over. And so when Espira is in the interior and he's looking for civilizations or he's looking for anything that's going to help him make a profit, a lot of his men are discussing this idea of over the next ridge there might be El Dorado. And it doesn't help that many of these indigenous groups who are almost certainly communicating with one another and are utilizing different strategies, if they don't like the Europeans or don't want them in their territory, they sort of say, oh yes, we've seen these great cities, we've seen this gold, it's just over this ridge, it's just over this river. And then if you read in the documents, the very next day they try to cross this river and 30 guys die, or they go across this next ridge and there was an enemy settlement which has been waiting for someone to just sort of cross into their territory so they can attack. And these indigenous groups sort of are playing with the Europeans, especially by the time Espira is in charge, trying to get them either out or trying to figure out ways to get them to attack groups hostile to them. But this idea of an El Dorado, or this idea that there's some great city, maybe even the Inca themselves are just on this other side of this ridge, and maybe we can meet Pizarro at the Inca capital in a short time.
Yeah, so I mean, at this point they had kind of realized, okay, well, there's no easy passage to the Pacific, but we do know there's this very rich land kind of to our southwest, and so if we head vaguely that way, there must be surely some other incredibly rich, land overflowing with gold somewhere vaguely in between that. And in the meantime, everyone they meet along the way is saying, oh yeah, totally, just round the mountain, next bends, can't miss it.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone is saying that. And when they're writing it in the documents, I don't want to say that they believe it, but the fact that they're writing it down and they're continuing makes me just assume that they are believing it. And if they're not, then they're not picking different pathways. They're not preparing themselves for a battle that's probably going to happen. So in my mind, I think they are sort of falling into this trap of believing their own sort of sick, twisted idea that things are going to get better, I promise. Things are going to turn out well. We're going to get back to the coast and we're all going to be carrying too much gold to even walk. And we're going to go back to Spain or Bavaria and build our own castles.
Given the history of colonization in the Americas at that point, I mean, I guess I could see implausible. The Spanish land in Hispaniola and get rich there. They go to Cuba, they get rich there. They go to Mexico and get rich there. They go to Panama and get rich there. They go to Peru, get rich there. Why wouldn't they get rich here as well? Although clearly there are some problems with that pattern continuing on indefinitely. So does Espira come back with anything on that expedition?
Espira comes back with experience, really. He has with him a handful of men who have been in Venezuela for a few years, that maybe came in 1534, 1533. They know how to fight. They know how to survive. One individual who is with him is a rather unlikely character. His name is Philip von Hutten. Von Hutten is essentially an aristocrat. He was raised in the court of Charles I. His playmates were some of who would later be some of Philip II's major ministers and royal officials. And he comes over in 1534, sort of this little Lord Fauntleroy of the Caribbean, and he turns out to be a rather experienced leader. And he turns out to be an excellent Indian fighter and warrior. And he and a few others sort of get this experience and are with Espira. They believe in what they're doing. They believe that they can actually find something. They encourage Espira to continue on. By the time they get back to Coro, everything is in shambles in terms of the political system in Coro. Espira's been gone for too long. And unfortunately, Port Espira is just trying to struggle to hold on. So he doesn't come back with anything other than his men still like him. And his men now have at least the ability to say they've survived this great 3-year expedition, this entrada, and they can go back. And this time they're going to succeed when they go back. They sort of convince themselves.
So he comes back with a lesson learned and not much else.
More or less, yes, sir.
But at the same point, there's also kind of a parallel expedition running under another German named Federmann, correct?
Yeah, Nicholas Federmann is perhaps my favorite character in all of this. He's this redheaded German from Ulm. He leaves for the Americas in 1529. He's in Santo Domingo for a time, and he comments sort of about the demographic change in Hispaniola when he lands in Santo Domingo. He talks about disease and how terrible the European presence has been for the population there. So he's obviously an educated man and sort of understands something else is going on here besides us being here. He doesn't say disease, but he's very clearly recognizing that there wasn't this great sickness and there was a great population before we were here. So he has that in his mind. He goes into Venezuela in 1530. He befriends Alfenker. He befriends a guy named Juan Seisenhofer, who the Spaniards very thankfully just renamed Juan Aleman just because they can't pronounce Seisenhofer.
Which those who don't speak Spanish, that basically just means John the German.
Absolutely, and that happens several times. And so Federmann sort of gets himself into this sort of handful of men who are really in charge of Welser Venezuela on the ground. He's appointed as sort of a captain of an expedition. He's appointed as a lieutenant governor for a time. And when Alfenker goes to sort of have some convalescence in Santo Domingo, Alfenker does something he's not supposed to do, which he goes on his own expedition into the southeast area of sort of their territory. So he goes southeast for the first time. He's the only expedition that does. He finds all of these different indigenous groups. He writes down how many days it took to get from one to the other. He talks about what they're wearing. He talks about their different languages. He tries to enslave a few and quite wisely realizes that's going to be a bit of a problem. He's not the most diplomatic man on earth, but he does sort of realize that there's a lot out here. He goes back to Coro. Alfenker is there. He's furious, and he's expelled from Venezuela, and he's sent back home. And so within a year of this expedition, in 1532, he's back at a bar in Ulm, and he starts to write down exactly what he's found. He writes this great letter to the king, which is eventually published many years later, called The Indian History. And it's a beautiful sort of account, an ethno-history of what's going on in Venezuela. But it's sort of unfortunate that we don't have anything for the western side, just this eastern side.
It seems like, he does what is most important for historians later, which is to keep detailed and vivid records and write everything down.
It's a beautiful record. Now, whether it's accurate or not is a different question, but historians have really been using it ever since then to sort of figure out where indigenous groups are roughly, what they were like, maybe if there's different cultural differences between one group to the next. And Alfenker seems to have an eye for this. He has an eye for people and an eye for sort of the landscape and the environment, which many of the others don't have. While he's writing this, he gets word that Alfenker has died. And he sees this as a perfect opportunity to maybe get back to Venezuela. I mean, this is a guy in 1534. There is an idea that something is in Peru. There's an idea that the Mayan sort of structure in the Yucatan is ready to be conquered as the Mexica were conquered. There are still even groups that are in Mexico that are still fighting. It's still if you have the money to leave Europe and go anywhere, you can go anywhere. But Alfenker wants to go back to Venezuela. And he goes to the crown of Charles I. He says, not only do I know the area, not only do I know the people like me, the people know me there, the Europeans like me there, send me back. And instead, Espira is chosen over him. But Federmann continues on to Venezuela, and he goes and he serves as Espira's assistant. Now, Espira apparently didn't really care to learn about Federmann's history, or maybe he thought that he'd learned his lesson, because as soon as Espira has gone on his expedition, Federmann starts planning one of his own. He goes off and tries to set up some pearl fisheries on the northern coast of Maracaibo. It doesn't really go very well. He tries to do some work in Maracaibo, tries to set up a sort of a slave trade system out of Maracaibo that will be more prosperous than the one Alfenker developed. It doesn't go very well. But he gets word that Espira is returning from his expedition, and Federman, who really doesn't like serving under people, it seems, decides to heck with this. He gets a group of men and he goes west. And instead of going along the Andes, as many of the other expeditions had done and would do, he decides to go over the Andes, and he winds up in Bogota with 2 other Spanish expeditions that had sort of found that area. And Bogota is so much better than coastal Venezuela. The weather is cooler. The Indians there are, in his words, nicer. There is salt that can be had and sold. There's emeralds everywhere. It's a beautiful place. So he's sort of gone off on his own, and he's found his own civilization. He's done what every other group in Venezuela had been trying to do, which is to find the civilization to exploit it on their own. And so sort of Federman leaves the picture. He travels back to Europe to sort of claim this, and his claims are sort of lost in the administrative system. The Welser family really doesn't like that he's disobeyed orders, and they sue him. He's not been paying certain taxes, and he dies, unfortunately, in 1542 under house arrest. But he's one of the few guys that sort of says, I don't like what's going on. I'm going to try something different. And those small things, this idea that he can have risk, maybe high risk for high yield rewards, is something that he can do, and he does it, and he's rather successful at it. And the men follow him and like him.
Now, part of the other problem with his claims is that, as you mentioned, he was running into Spanish expeditions kind of, even as the Germans were, marching west, the Spanish expeditions were kind of marching east. And it sounds like there was a bit of a counterclaims and even a little bit of almost a scuffle out in the now Bogota area. Yeah,
you had Jimenez de Quesada, who was from Santa Marta and had been moving south and sort of found Bogota by accident. You had Belalcazar, who had sort of come from the Ecuador area and sort of found Bogota also. And then you have Federman. And Federman is, I think, maybe one of maybe 8 or 9 guys who are German. The rest are all Spaniard, or at least all sort of Iberian. And so you have all of these guys sort of in one area, and their allegiances are to their leaders, but you also have Spaniards who are with Federman, who sort of are iffy on this idea of a German leading them. They've never been really sure that he's not a Lutheran, although that's not a big issue for most of them. And so you have this idea that these outsiders, either Europeans with sort of ties to the Holy Roman Empire, or Europeans who are very late to the game, like Belalcazar, or those who are coming in the late 1530s, are newcomers. And that's the old guard, those that have been here since the late teens, the early 20s. These are the ones that should have claim to these areas. These are the ones that should be in charge. And so Federman goes to try to dispute all of these issues and be able to claim Bogota for himself and for the Welsers, and he's just not able to do it. Although he's listed as a co-founder. If you go to Bogota, you can see that Quesada is sort of revered, but he's always referred to as a co-founder of Bogota. And they mean he co-founded with Federman and Belalcazar.
Now, to loop back around to our earlier theme of people dying in Venezuela, Espira himself passes away shortly after this.
This is one of the ones that I became so angry about, because I could not find out what happened to him. He's there. He meets with Rodrigo de Bastidas, the bishop. They have a sort of a secret conference where Bastidas is sort of bad-mouthing him in public, saying what a terrible man he is. They meet together, and then Bastidas exits whatever tent they're in and sort of says, I've misjudged this man. We should all get behind this man. He sort of really changes his attitude. But shortly after this meeting, he dies. And that's all it sort of says, is that, he passed. And there's nothing else. There was no talk about a sickness. There was no injury that is mentioned. It's just that he dies. And I've struggled so long in Seville at the Archivo General de Indias to try to find anything that can sort of reveal what's happened to poor Espira, because he really did want, I think, to set up Venezuela as a real colony and maybe establish it very much in the Caribbean system of let's build a town, let's have farms before we start exploring outside. But his death, his premature death, just takes that idea out the window.
Well, I mean, the anthropological side of me says, "Where's he buried? Let's go dig him up and find out."
Well, I would like to know that too.
But that leaves the previous man you talked about, von Hutten, in charge.
Yeah, von Hutten there's a number of guys in charge, and it's very unclear exactly who's running the show. If you look at what the documents say, Rodrigo de Bastidas is technically the governor. Even though he's the bishop, he is sort of the interim governor. Anytime there's any sort of question about who's really in charge, it's, Bastidas is in charge, because he's the elder statesman, he's the religious official, he's quite wealthy in his own right, so he sort of has this authority to him. He lets Hutten be captain general, but he's also sending out other Spanish, trusted conquistadors, Pedro de Limpias as one, and a few others, out into the interior of Venezuela in the 1540s to try to find something, try to find anything. And what I've been able to sort of figure out is that Bastidas is trying to get as many Indian slaves as possible, perhaps clear out any indigenous group that's going to threaten his authority or the authority of the Europeans. As long as they're moved from the picture, then they can start maybe colonizing Venezuela proper. They can get rid of all these warriors, they can get rid of all these entradas, they can start to set up farms in the settlement, and he can start this conversion process of the few indigenous groups that are peaceful to him. But he sends out von Hutten with 200 guys who are on foot, 150 horsemen. Now, the idea is that he's going to find El Dorado. The idea is that he's going to find maybe another indigenous settlement. Hutton's orders are not very clear. Bastidas is not very clear in giving them. He's not very clear in recording them.
It's kind of go out there and find something.
Yeah, find something. Now, Pedro de Limpias and a few others, he's more clear with. It's you take 500 horsemen and you bring back slaves. And Pedro de Limpias does this. But with Hutten, it's a little bit confusing. With Hutten, though, again, you have this aristocracy. With Hutten is actually the son of the Welser patriarch. So the son of the corporation, the son of the whole business is with him. He's also, he's named Bartholomew Welser, and he's the next heir to this great corporation. And he's in Venezuela, and he's with Hutten. And he's sort of learning on the ground how to be a conquistador, how to be this slave trader. And Philip von Hutten takes them into the interior. They search around for a while. Things aren't going too well. They meet up with Limpias. The situation back in Coro deteriorates. They give the sort of lieutenant governorship, they give the command of Coro to a man named Juan de Carvajal. He had been in Venezuela for a number of years already. Carvajal moves the capital from Coro to this new settlement, Tacuyo, and invites Limpias into Cuyo, tells him, we're tired of the Germans. We don't want the Germans here. We don't want the Luteranos here. We don't want the Lutherans here. Now, whether or not he really cared about sort of religious orthodoxy is, I think, disputed. I think Carvajal really just wanted to be in charge. And so he invites this sort of broken Philip von Hutten and Bartholomew Welser, who their expedition really hasn't done anything. They need to resupply. They need to rest. He invites him into the Cuyo, and he tells Philip von Hutten, we're taking over. You need to get out. Philip von Hutten rejects this. He continues on to Coro, and there are few written accounts of what happens next. Probably the best that really exists is that Carvajal and his men surround Philip von Hutten and young Welser and their supporters. They charge them with heresy. They charge them with abuse of Europeans. They charge them with not fulfilling their contract from 1528. So this is 20 years after this ridiculous contract is drawn up. They're saying you haven't fulfilled it. Philip von Hutten refuses to really give in. And in a rather strange sort of display of power, Carvajal puts Welser and Hutten on their knees. He gets an African slave with a rusty sword to sort of come forward from this circle of men, and he beheads both of them. He doesn't even let them confess their sins. He gives them no last rites, which many of the men who are writing sort of talk about. This was very strange that he didn't do this. In fact, he said, I think Hutten is the one who asked if he could have last rites, and before his head was removed from his body, it's been reported that Carvajal said, you can tell your sins to God. So he executes the captain general, and he executes the son of the corporation that's sort of funding this whole thing in 1546. And I guess he assumes he's going to get away with it, or he assumes he's going to be supported. But the Spanish administration is very quick to come down on him, capture him, arrest him, and execute him for that crime. But with the death of Hutten and Welser, German control in Venezuela essentially ends. They keep Venezuela as their property by right, by contract, until about 1555 to 1557. It's a little unclear. Essentially, as soon as Charles I abdicates in 1556, it's all over. And Welser authority is essentially dead, but it had been dead about a decade before with the death of Hutton and Welser.
Now, I have a couple questions I want to kind of follow up on, why this colony didn't thrive. So I suppose my major question would be, why did this German colony in Venezuela, why did this Welser colony not thrive? That's a very broad question, of course, but it seems like all around it, there were these other colonies that are being set up along the Spanish model of encomiendas, and even though they didn't have encomiendas in Venezuela, they certainly had other things they could be doing. They could be farming, they could be ranching. You mentioned pearls. They could be, heading over towards the Bogota area and mining emeralds. There's all sorts of things they could have been doing, but it seems like they just kind of did a bunch of enslaving and then wandering around in the jungle.
Yeah, the history of colonial Latin America, if we were to just step back and look at every expedition that occurs, every contract that is made for settlers to go into an area and exploit it, pacify it is the term that the Spaniards use, there aren't that many successful expeditions. You have a very successful sort of Caribbean model, but it's mainly island hopping. You have a very successful Cortez, which I think most of us, including you, because you're an expert on this, would probably be saying it still amazes me that was successful. You have Pizarro, who sort of takes advantage of an odd situation and is successful. But if you look at everything other than that, there's not a lot of success. Maybe in St. Augustine with Menendez, but the rest is about failure. And a lot of these expeditions fail or are not able to get off the ground as well as they had hoped. And so if you look at the history of colonial Latin America, especially this early contact period, as a history of failure and how you overcome failure, then we can sort of explain Venezuela. Because the Germans had, or at least the South Germans, this business model they had was you expand from town to town, city to city, you slowly acquire new economic routes, new trade routes, and then you move beyond that. Once they got into the Caribbean, they'd sort of ended their success, because once they got into Venezuela, there were no more trade routes they could get. The gold and silver that they'd hoped would be there wasn't there. The indigenous slaves that they were bringing in were making money. To be honest, they're making a considerable amount of money, but it's on the decline. Over the years, you start to see the money they're getting from this is not going to sustain them for very long, especially since the African slave trade's coming in. So if your model has always been you just expand and it's going to happen. You're going to have success. You go to this next town, you take it over, you acquire the resources, and you move. It'll be successful for you. They don't have that in Venezuela. And so they're not used to failure. And their idea of failure means that you just didn't accomplish the prior steps. And so when they're going into Maracaibo and they set up a small town, they set up a small town in Coro, they're not able to set up any more towns. They have trouble doing that. They have trouble meeting with indigenous groups. They have trouble setting up trade networks. And so instead of maybe trying something new, as Fetterman had done, because Fetterman tried multiple things, and he finally figured out, well, why don't I just leave and I'll go somewhere else? And that's where he finds success. But all these other expeditions essentially follow the same path. Alfenker's second expedition follows roughly the same path as Espira's expedition. Espira's expedition sort of laid the groundwork for Philip von Hutten, who followed almost the identical path. They're repeating the same mistakes over and over again, perhaps with the hopes of this time it's going to work because that's how the strategy is supposed to go. You just haven't followed it correctly the first time, and that's why you failed. So while the Spaniards sort of had this mentality of we're going to try different things and whatever works, we're going to repeat until it failed, and we'll try something new, which we see happen throughout the Caribbean and the mainland. The Germans in Venezuela aren't doing this. They are repeating the same thing over and over again with the hopes that it'll turn out, and it just doesn't.
Now, after this, did the Welsers ever try to regroup and, aim for a different area or try again? Or did this kind of dissuade them from going over into the Americas? And in them being dissuaded, did it dissuade other groups from trying similar kind of ventures? No,
the Welsers are always in the Americas. And this is what's so exciting, is that the conquest of the New World is really this truly Atlantic conquest. It's not just about Iberians. It's about Central Europeans, Eastern Europeans, because you can find them in every expedition. You can find them in every settlement somewhere. There is somebody who is not Iberian, who's doing something rather important. who's doing something that matters to the economy or to the administration in a big way, mainly because of where they're from and what they have been trained to do or what their culture sort of is doing. And we find Welsers have considerable investments in what would become Zacatecas in Mexico, in these mines. And we find them in the Caribbean still as small offices in Santo Domingo, working on trade goods and sending that back to Europe. And we also see them investing in other expeditions. They may not be taking a part of it physically. They may not be picking up a sword as Alfinger and Federman had done, but they're putting money forward to try to make these networks. They're doing what they had always done, which is find ways to move forward. And so once they lose this Venezuela venture, they're not going to put any more money in it. I think they allow it to sort of die off along with Charles, and they sort of ignore it. But even into the 1530s and 40s and 50s, they're still there. They have their hand in multiple pots, and even into the 1560s and 70s, they are in Mexico in a small way. They are in Peru in a small way, and they're still lending money to Philip II. They're still trying to help him fight this war in Europe to maintain his control. And they're also trying to work in the Americas to build up their own economic base.
To look at this from the other side of the Atlantic, though, we had mentioned how a lot of this, the slave trade that was going on was, one group of indigenous people, selling off their enemies to the other, and how the South Germans were moving through and making alliances, getting to know people, and I would assume being a very generally disruptive force. So, do we have any idea of what the effect of this venture was on the native people around in that area?
Well, Neil Whitehead, who writes extensively about sort of the eastern Venezuela and the Guyana area, has ideas of what's going on. It doesn't really translate into the West, but disease is a big problem, but they're there. They sort of move away from the coast, but they're still there. In Western Venezuela, we don't have a true sense about how much disease disrupted those areas. I would assume it did a great deal. However, we can also discuss that or speculate that the diseases that wiped out parts of the Inca spread out into the east, into Venezuela, and before Pizarro arrived. So it's very possible that the Welsers and the Europeans who are there are having a significant impact on the human landscape of Western Venezuela from disease, but they're also clearing them out through slaving. And so you have many of these groups that are moving south or moving into the highlands or moving closer to the Andes themselves to try to escape what this onslaught of slave trading and slave raids that are occurring. But having a true ethnohistory of Venezuela at the moment for Western Venezuela is rather difficult to do for this early period. What you have in Peru, what you have in Mexico in terms of looking at numbers, culture, how these things are changed over time, you don't have in Venezuela because we don't have the written records and we just don't have a sense for who's there exactly, where are they, what are they doing. We just don't have that.
I think this is going to bring us to our epilogue here, where I just want to ask you, what is the lasting, lingering legacy of this German colony in Venezuela? I mean, what is its legacy, not just, in the broader colonial sense, but in Venezuela itself, or even back in Germany, particularly South Germany?
Well, if you go to Ulm, they have a very respectable opinion of Federman. They like this idea that they are connected to the Americas. They like this idea that they were part of this colonial experience. They try not to focus too much on sort of the negative aspects of what conquest is and pacification techniques are, but they like this idea that at one point they were successful enough that they were essentially asked to settle the New World. In Venezuela and in the Americas, it's a little bit different. There are statues to Federman. There's, I think if you go to parts of the Southwest Maracaibo region, there is sort of the Valley of Death, the Valley of Alfinger. There are statues to Alfinger. There's a statue to Federman, I believe, in northern, on the coast of Colombia, where he set up a pearl mining or a salt sort of collecting area. So they're there, but they're not seen as sort of positive models. Sort of these conquistador Europeans are never really given that positive image. But there's two different ways that they're seen. There's this American vision of they're exploiting, they're cruel, they're domineering, They were doing things that were more evil than the Spaniards, although that's not true. And then there's this idea from Europe, which is we were successful, we made it, we got there, we tried, we didn't achieve all of our goals, but no one ever does. There is sort of this idea in Germany of we got there and we did something. It's a shame it didn't quite work out.
Well, Spencer, I want to thank you for speaking to us today on the Ask Historians podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
And as always, thank you so much for listening. And a particular thanks to everyone who is contributing to our Patreon account. That is www.patreon.com/AskHistorians. I mentioned in the last episode that we were rolling out some ideas about what to do now that we've met our basic operating costs for our hosting. So I have some books picked out that we're going to have a selection, and we'll raffle one of those off kind of to our contributed members. I will have more details on that in the next episode, so you'll just have to wait in suspense until then. In the meantime, though, you can fill up that time by going to SoundCloud. We are Ask Historians on SoundCloud, and we put a link to that account in every single one of our discussion posts that you can go to and just jump right into. Because of your generous donations, we've been able to get a premium account on SoundCloud, so I've been putting up our back catalog up on there, and I've noticed that some of you have actually been going through and listening to them. So I hope you're enjoying that. Keep in mind that the further back into the history of the Ask Historians podcast you go, the rougher the episodes get as I go from not knowing what I'm doing to knowing what I'm doing. So hopefully you can really hear the difference and see how much that I have fortunately been fortunate enough to learn about sound design and recording and editing. And I don't know, you may just assume that I'd sold my soul to Crossroads or something like that. But if I did that, I assure you, I would get more than just a podcast out of it. If you have any questions about this particular podcast, we do a discussion post for every single episode that comes out. You can go to www.reddit.com/r/AskHistorians. We sticky the discussion post right at the top of the sub there, so you can always find it on Fridays and sometimes, turning over into Saturdays. But even if you're stopping by a couple weeks later, feel free to post a question in there, and I'll make sure that it gets to our guest so he can respond to it. Or you can just respond directly to him. They usually put up a comment in there with sources and notes and little things that they forgot to cover in the episode, or little things they want to go over a little more. And if you really, 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 really cannot get enough amazing historical knowledge poured into your brain, we do have a Twitter account at AskHistorians. Very simple, very straightforward, where we highlight a lot of our great posts that are coming through kind of in real time. If you want it in a little more compact form, apparently not everyone knows about our Sunday Digest post, which is basically a best of post that we put up every Sunday, which just takes all the best comments that have been brought up in the sub over the past week and just puts them right in there. It's very easy to miss some great comments, because sometimes the most popular questions, they don't get the best answers, while sometimes something with 4 upvotes gets a college a PhD dissertation written on it. So you can go by and always check out those and go through the back catalog. It really shows some of the amazing answers that go on in Ask Historians. And finally, of course, next episode in 2 weeks, we will be coming back and we'll be staying in kind of the Caribbean area. In fact, we will be in the Caribbean. We will be talking to Welsers, and we will be talking about the decline and end of British Caribbean slavery. So we'll hope to see you then on that fine and happy, fun topic. In the meantime, please do rate and review us on iTunes, leave a comment, 5 stars us, do whatever it is that you like to do on iTunes, particularly because that bumps us up in their recommended lists. But just on whatever platform you happen to be listening and allows rating, please give us a good rating. And if you don't like the show, of course, just don't rate us at all, and don't tell anyone. But if you do like the show, rate us highly and tell everyone you know. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.